Wonderful, everyone. Let's get started. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Pierce, and I'm the director of the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts, and your host for tonight's conversation. The Transnational Series focuses on stories of migration, the intersection of politics and literature, and works in translation. I just want to offer a quick Zoom webinar tutorial. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see a few icons. One of those is a Q&A icon where you can enter in your questions at any time during the conversation. Another button will get you to the chat window. That space is there for you all. Please feel free to chat during the event. I will be in the chat as well, dropping in useful information, including links to books by our authors. We do make every effort to keep these events free to attend in the hopes that you'll purchase the featured books from us. So thank you in advance for taking a look and supporting independent bookstores. And finally, you can see us, but we can't see you, so relax and please enjoy the conversation. Tonight, I have the very great honor of introducing Alice Guthrie and Omar Berrada here to discuss and celebrate the release of Blood Feast, the complete short stories of Malika Moustadraf. Alice Guthrie is an independent translator, editor, and curator, specializing in contemporary Arabic writing. Her work often focuses on subaltern voices and activist art. She is currently compiling the first ever anthology of LGBTQIA+ Arabic writing, set to appear in parallel Arabic and English editions. She teaches literary translation at the University of Exeter and the University of Birmingham. And tonight's moderator, Omar Berrada, is a writer and curator and the director of Dar al Mamoun, a library and artist residency in Marrakesh. He is the author of the poetry collection Clonal Hum and the editor or co-editor of several books, including The Africans, a volume on racial dynamics in North Africa, and Ahmed Bouanani's History of Moroccan Cinema. His writing has been published in numerous exhibition catalogs, magazines, and anthologies, including Badoon, Asymptote, the University of California Book of Northern African Literature, and Poetic Justice, an anthology of contemporary Moroccan poetry. Currently living in New York, he teaches at the Cooper Union, where he co-organizes the IDS lecture series. I'm so thrilled to have them here together in conversation. And now, Alice and Omar.
Thank you, Pierce. Thank you for having us. Hello, Alice.
Hi, Omar. Hi, everyone.
Very good to see you again. As we were saying earlier, it's too bad this is not in person. You and I have met once in person a long time ago in Paris, but it's nice to see you here. And this, we haven't seen the book, so I might as well show it. We're here to celebrate this, Blood Feast, which is the complete short stories of Malika Moustadraf, which you translated from the Arabic, and from, in particular, this book, which I'll show as well, because few people have ever seen it, actually. This is the Arabic volume, this thin little volume published in 2004 called 36, or 36, in French Moroccan, of Malika Moustadraf's short stories. And I'm particularly happy that this book is coming out, that you have translated it, and that we're getting to celebrate it. For many reasons. I mean, one of them is very general, which is that there's very little Moroccan literature translated into English from Arabic. There's been a few translations these last years. Most of them have been from the French, actually, right? Alexander Ellenson has been translating a few novels by Youssef Fadel. He's also translated Yassine Adnan's novel. Much longer ago, Leila Abu Zaid's books, or some of them, were translated into English from Arabic. And then there's, of course, other examples, especially from the French, but from Arabic and from Morocco, there don't seem to be that much. And I think it's the first book by a Moroccan author that you're translating yourself, right?
Well, it's the first published book, yeah. I mean, funnily enough, actually, the first kind of long translation that I ever did back at university was part of was like half of Rashid Nini's Yomiyat Muhajir Sirri, like the diaries of a clandestine migrant, and I've also done recently very long excerpts, sort of half novel excerpts from Mohammed Zafzaf and also Aziz Ben Hadoush, which are published on a website. But yeah, in a book form, yes, it is, and I agree that there needs to be much more actually brought over, I think, from Arabic, from Morocco.
Yeah, and the other and more specific reason why I'm happy this book is being published is because it is this book. It is Malika Moustadraf, and this particular short story collection. Maybe one thing I should say is that in Morocco, like the short story as a form is a very prominent, in a way, a very alive genre of Moroccan writing, especially in Arabic, and that it's led for the most part. I mean, for the most part, but there are quite a few amazing women writers of short stories in Morocco, and Malika Moustadraf was one. She unfortunately is somebody who died very young. Perhaps we can just say the date. She was born in 1969 and she died in 2006, so she was 36 or 37. And she published 2 books in her lifetime, right? This book of short stories and previously a very short novel. And so it's hard to know what her production would have been afterwards, because as you say in your afterword, the few stories that she published after 36, after this book, and that you include in your translation, show a very rapid evolution of her style that makes you wonder what she would have written afterwards if she had kept on writing.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so perhaps we can say a couple of general things about Malika Moustadraf and her work before reading an excerpt, so that people can have a sense of her language. I'm interested in knowing what clicked for you when you first read her work. What made you want to read more? What made you want to translate it and make a book happen?
Yeah, well, the first story of hers that I came across, I think, was Delusion, which is the second now in this collection, I believe. And yeah, and I really it just seemed like kind of electrifying writing to me, with the I guess the detail, the kind of irreverent juxtapositions of stuff that she goes for, um, the way that she kind of examines people's experience and people's voice, and like the way that she does bodily disgust, and the way that she uses bits of popular snippets of lyrics and stuff like that. The stories are short, and some of them don't really have a sort of narrative arc as we would think of it, but there's so much packed into them, you know. And that particular story, Delusion, which is told from a male point of view, and there was so much happening. And then I started to read the others, and Just Different, which has a trans and or intersex protagonist in a very complex, nuanced, and sympathetic portrait of that person's experience, just in a way that I hadn't read at all in Arabic before, and in fact I haven't since. So they were some of the early impressions that I had. Yeah, I mean, I remember being really, really, really struck by her work, and thinking like, I've got to find the rest of it and I've got to work on it. So yeah.
Yeah, that corresponds to my experience too, first reading her work. I mean, even, coming from Morocco and kind of recognizing some of the settings of the stories, the way that she, in this kind of razor sharp way, very direct language, and at the same time very sophisticated, because it plays on several registers of language. And this way that this very sympathetic and complex way with which she approaches marginal characters was extremely striking and new. Yeah.
So did you read it in 2004 when it came out then?
Not at all, because I think I when I read it, she had already died. It must have been maybe 2010 or something. And I think technically the book has been out of print forever. And I think when I found it, it was already out of print. But as with these things, books like this aren't very much distributed. I mean, it was only distributed in Morocco. It was published by the مجموعة البحث في القصة القصيرة بالمغرب, so the research collective on the short story in Morocco, which is really a collective of writers and researchers. She was published by a collective of her peers, essentially. And they had this series of books that they published of short stories, and also a journal called Qaf Saad. And so it had very small distribution. And I think it was one year I was at the book fair in Casablanca, and they had a small booth, and there were some of their publications, and this book was there, and somebody said, "Oh my God, this book is there, you should get it because you won't find it anywhere else." So probably there were just a few left, and they had them on at their booth. And so I had no context really. I just the person who recommended that I get it also recommended that I read it, obviously, and so
and
it made
a massive impression on you also instantly, or?
Yes.
Because I'm interested, because obviously my perspective as an outsider is, has to be different. As a translator reading in a second language, you read it in your home language, and it struck you really hard too.
Oh, very much so, because she seemed to have some kind of, I mean, it's silly to say it like this, but some kind of a direct access to reality in some way, right? There was something whereby characters' lives, a certain reality of social relations of domination were laid bare in a few words, a few sentences. It was like an opening of something. It's very shocking in a way, the first reading, because it's very, the reality that you get a glimpse into is very raw. But at the same time, as I said, there's a lot of tenderness I feel that she has for the people, the characters and their relations, and even the ones who are not necessarily the ones you'd like to empathize with immediately, right? Even some of the characters who are not the ones that maybe she identifies with the most are treated or described or have this kind of, they're not flat. Nobody's flat, and nothing is flat in these stories. Not the style, not the characters, not the settings.
Yeah, I mean, I get the impression of her as a person from what I've read of. I mean, I've read sort of everything that you can find of her words online, interviews, and various things, and also what people have told me, that she was something really fierce about her, and that she was kind of like, quick to anger. And I mean, I quite like that quality, actually. But that she was. She didn't suffer fools, and like one of her favorite expressions verbally, I gather, was like that something could put you to sleep standing up. And it comes actually, in one other text that she wrote, it's like that was her insult. Like she wants it to be, right there and happening. But this thing about having this kind of like direct line to reality, I mean, I feel like gritty or realist is a word. Those words are kind of bandied around. Actually, they're quite a little bit too easily said, maybe about work. It can be a bit of a lazy, shorthand. Oh, it's gritty, but in her case, I think it really is. And it's and also the other thing that is noticed about her is that she's taboo breaking, and yeah, that's important. But lots of writers are breaking taboo. You can break taboos without being a good writer, right? And she's bringing, as you say, so much sympathy and warmth and complexity. She likes everything to be multi-layered. She's almost challenging us, like, listen to this man talk, listen to how horrible he's being about his wife, and don't you also feel really sorry for him? She's kind of challenging us, I feel, which is something that I find really interesting.
And I think what's really impressive with it is that she does that in these very short stories. So they're very condensed, and the language is very quick. And so I can imagine this was not easy work to do for you to translate. And perhaps we can read a bit now from 36.
Yeah, this story 36 was the title story of the original collection. This collection that Omar held up, another of the hen's teeth copies that I have here in Bristol, which was actually gifted to me by her publisher because they're so rare. But that was the title story. This was the title story of that collection. But in this expanded collection, which includes the other stories, that were a couple of which were published after her death, goes by the title Blood Feast, which is also another story. But this is her. I feel it's quite significant that this was a story that she obviously wanted to foreground a bit, because she chose it as the title for the collection.
And I'll just say that I'll read just a little bit of what Alice is going to be reading. I'll read some of it in Arabic just so that our audience
that you get to hear her voice. Yeah. Okay, and so we're just jumping in the middle here, and yeah, it's a young girl who finds her father very, very hard, and she's having a difficult Saturday. My father closes my bedroom door. He's given me half a round flatbread with some canned fish in it. As soon as he's gone, I throw it out the window. Won't lock the door, but don't try to come out. From the other room wafts the scent of grilling meat. My mouth starts watering. I push the door ajar. Lascivious laughter, rude words, that delicious scent creeping into my nose. My guts go into a frenzy, and it's getting hard to keep my rumbling stomach quiet. I swallow my spit with difficulty, fingering the few dirhams in my pyjama pocket. Tomorrow I'll buy half a kofta and onion sandwich. Larbi always looks gross, his big wobbly belly hanging over his food cart, his fingers up his nose. After he's done digging around for boogers, he goes right back to flipping the pieces of kofta and sausage. But it doesn't matter, his food is delicious, and maybe the filth adds to the flavour. He has even more customers crowding around his stall than flies landing on his chopped onion and tomato.
يقفل أبي علي باب غرفتي. يعطيني نصف خبزة بها بعض السمك المعلب. أرمي بها فور خروجه من النافذة. لن أقفل الباب بالمفتاح، لكن لا تحاول الخروج. من الغرفة الأخرى تنبعث رائحة الشواء. يتحلب ريقي. أفتح الباب قليلا. ضحكات خليعة. كلمات نابية. الرائحة الشهية تتسلل إلى أنفي. معدتي تصبح في حالة هيجان قصوى. وأصبح من الصعب إسكات قرقرة مصاريني. أبتلع ريقي بصعوبة. أتحسس الدراهم القليلة في جيب بيجامتي. غدا سأشتري نصف خبزة ممتلئة بصلا وكفتة. العربي شكله مقرف. بطنه تمتد وتتدلى فوق العربة. يمسح مخاطه ويعاود قلب أصابع الكفتة والنقانق. لكن لا يهم. أكله لذيذ، وربما هذا العفن ما يزيد من لذة أكله. فالزبائن يتجمعون حول عربته أكثر من الذباب الذي يحط على البصل والطماطم المفرومة.
I'm going to carry on from a little later in the story. This Saturday night, I feel a searing pain rip through my belly. Something warm is pouring out from between my thighs and running down my legs. It smells foul. I understand, but I don't know what to do. I put my hand between my legs to stop this disgusting contamination from flowing. My fingers are covered in blood. A droplet falls, dark as liver. I shudder. The iron bed frame creaks. My teeth chatter. I feel degraded, humiliated. I'm cringing in abject shame. What if the blood floods the whole room, the stairs, the neighbourhood? I cry out. My father comes. His eyes are half closed. What's the matter? His voice sounds like a death rattle. What's the matter? His eyes are half open. What's the matter? His face is long and his forehead bulges more than ever. Little curly hairs he wishes would conceal his bald patch. What's the matter? His voice gets sharper. Tears like grains of sand, like needles piercing my eyes. What's the matter? I want my mum. He pulls off the bed cover. He can see my private parts. My sheets are sopping with blood. My hand is between my thighs. I'm still trying to stop this disgraceful bleeding. It continues. He looks down and his eyes are shards of glass, taking in the scandal-soiled sheets. He looks at my breasts, at the red zits that cover my face. His Adam's apple goes up and down while he scratches the back of his neck. I shake my head from left to right as if defending myself from an accusation. He opens the closet and pulls out an old foot towel. He holds it out for a moment, then chucks it at me hard. He spits on the floor and leaves the room. I'm still cowering in a ball on the bed. I look at the bloodstain, at the scratchy towel. Here comes the woman who does all that shameless stuff with my father. Now she's coming right into my room. She's concealing her nakedness with a white cloth wrap. She laughs a gelatinous, brazen, and mirthless laugh. Then, in her smoker's rasp, she says, "Come on, best get on with it. You're a woman now." That day I hated my father, I hated my body, and I loved my mother. And I guess I wanted to read that bit also because, there can never be enough menstrual lit for my liking in the world. It's not unshocking in English, that kind of description, like let alone in Arabic. And yeah, I just wanted to honor that because I think it's quite a strong feminist act, actually.
Yes, and the book is not. I mean, they're not rare in this book. These kinds of feminist acts, I would say.
Yeah.
And I suppose that was one of the draws for you in working on it. And I'm interested in in knowing more about your process of translating. I mean, how is this text? I mean, from the point of view of somebody who translates from Arabic on a regular basis, what was peculiar about this text from the point of view of translating it, of rendering it into English? What was easy, what was hard, what was surprising, and what are the steps that you went through? Because you've been working on this for quite a while, knowing that it is a pretty thin book on the surface.
On the surface, yeah. Yeah, and I guess part of what I've been working on for quite a long time is trying to understand her life and find out, what happened and why she died and things like that. But yeah, the translation itself has been hard. I mean, one really obvious answer to that question is that my kind of home dialect as a second language speaker of Arabic is Shami, is Syrian, and not Moroccan, not Darija. I'm not a Darija speaker. I mean, I am in some elementary way, but that's not my bedrock. So that's a big obvious thing. That not that there's so much Darija in the book, but like not having lived in Morocco, there's lots of cultural references. I mean, you can Google stuff, singers and things. You can find a lot, can't you? But it's not the same as translating something from somewhere where you feel very grounded, culturally and linguistically grounded. Yeah, so there would be that, and I guess in some ways the sort of the economy of her language, this is kind of, it can be quite sparse, and that is harder, I think, to translate, right? Than because if somebody's like very wordy and it's very flowery, then you've kind of got more to play with. I mean, I'm not going to get into that translator cliche of what's the right metaphor for translation, but there is this thing, somebody, I think Susan Bonofsky said recently that it's like you're doing an imitation of someone's voice. You're around a campfire and you're saying, "Hey, I heard this, this person told me a story, and then they said, and I think that's quite useful to bear in mind, that that's what we're trying to do. And so perhaps if somebody's using a lot of language, then you've got kind of more to work with, and so imitating a sparse style is maybe harder.
And there's also, I mean, in this excerpt that you just read, it was very audible. There is something about the rhythm of her writing, right? There is a cadence, and there is a tension that that needs to be rendered in some way, and you did it beautifully in this passage in particular.
Well, thanks. And I should also, like, I mean, there's, I also want to say, I had a really incredible editor in Lauren Hook, and that has lifted the text to another level. And we had a really amazing kind of feminist collaborative editorial process. So shout out to Lauren. And yeah, I mean, I think with that kind of rhythm, I mean, I think that there's a violent, I mean, obviously that passage is not just, I said, oh, it's important because it's menstrual writing, but there's a real violence to it as well. Obviously that's not everyone's experience of menstruation. And so like, there's a real violence there, and that comes across in the rhythm, I think. And you can kind of hear her anger in how she's writing. And so I suppose that's, like the vexed question of voice in translation, right? You're trying to imitate it and get it right, and sometimes you feel it went better than others. Yeah. Actually, that it's funny that I read that bit, because that is a bit that I found particularly hard. I can remember reworking it a lot, partly because she uses so many different words around shame and humiliation, and that the repetition works a bit differently in Arabic as well, and doesn't necessarily work so well in English, and how far you go from that and come back and so on. So actually, I read that because I really love the passage, but it isn't necessarily the passage that I'm most happy with in the book. But anyway, we won't get into that.
That's okay. One of the things about Malika Moustadraf is that, in a way, she has a reputation that precedes her, and that kind of has marked the reception of her work in some kind of way, because of the themes that she's written about, because of the way she has written about certain themes, and because she died very young, so she hasn't really had a chance to speak for herself after that, in a way. And she died soon after this book was published, just a couple of years after that. And maybe it would be interesting to talk about the biography just a little bit, in the sense that, first of all, it has marked her literary trajectory, but also to kind of disentangle that a little bit, right? Like for instance, she had a long experience of illness that comes into play in the stories, because some of the themes in the book involve questions of illness and the healthcare system and things like that. And because, as you mentioned, and I had forgotten about this, but in the afterword, which is beautiful, by the way, it's a much longer afterword than translators' notes tend to be, and it's kind of a snippet from the kind of investigation, in a way, and research that you did around Malika, to kind of fill in certain blanks around the work and its publication and all of that. But for instance, so she had a kidney disease that crippled her for a long time. I mean, she had it since she was a teenager, so it was really, she lived with it all her adult life. And you mentioned that she couldn't find a publisher for her novel, her first book, and she decided to pay for it herself, to self-publish, or at least to pay for the publication, and that she had to take money. Basically, she used money that she would normally use for her medication, for her treatment, in order to publish her book. And so that in a certain sense, in a certain very real and literal sense, her work contributed to killing her.
Yeah, and when, as I mentioned in the afterword, when she was asked towards the end of her life if she regretted having done that, she said, yeah, absolutely. Which is, I mean, what do you do with somebody like, where do you put that? I mean, that someone says that. She says, it, roughly speaking, in my translation, she says, if I had known that that was going to lead to all this craziness, which was by that point that she was on crutches and was housebound and was really suffering terribly, she said, I never would have done it. And yet she also spoke a lot and repeatedly about how writing was her survival. So there's also this this paradox, isn't there, between what helps us survive mentally and what helps us survive physically, and the interplay of those elements with chronic illness. Is not straightforward, because she was really passionate about her writing and about writing in general, and about communicating with other writers, and towards the end of, so because she died in 2006, and so the last few years of her life was really the beginning of mainstream access to the internet, and she was an early adopter of MSN Messenger, or whatever, the early kind of chat apps that you could do on the computer, and she would communicate with people kind kind of across the world on that, and have long debates, and and it was hugely important to her, and that comes into the writing. So some of the later stories that she wrote, probably the last things that she wrote, she's playing with this idea of people. I mean, it's kind of cyber sex or cyber chat, early kind of sexting, I guess, or whatever, right? That she's writing about, and that would have seemed very kind of futuristic and new at the time. I mean, these things date so quickly, don't they? But
yeah, but it's very much present in the last stories for sure.
yeah, and I think that was fascinating to her, what might happen for people. And so in the story Housefly, for example, where you've got a woman who feels very trapped at home in a marriage that she's not at all enthusiastic about, and she's breastfeeding a baby, and the husband's out at work, and then she's having these various chats online, with one character who she's sort of clearly not into at all and who doesn't get her, and she's saying all these kind of strange things and he doesn't sort of pick up on it, and then the other guy comes on, and then they have this kind of really intellectual conversation with all these references and these fantasies, and so I think,
and Quranic references in the middle of some kind of amorous chat, right?
yeah. I mean, talking about stuff for translation challenges where you're like, huh, so what, why, what, and so the other shout out that I need to do is our mutual friend Nuruddin Zaraf, who helped me so much, so much on this project. And I would frequently, and we would have these long sessions going through the text. I'd be like, well, what's happening here? What on earth is this? What on earth is this? But I mean, something like that you could easily overlook. Just a very short phrase that is kind of recognizably Quranic, but not necessarily to the outsider.
Because there's no insistence. It's just there in the fabric of the text. So you can miss it for sure.
Yeah. And I think there's something to be said about the politics of, especially as the kind of, one's in danger of getting positioned as like a white expert on these matters, right? That there's something to be said about the politics of seeking help with this stuff. I feel like that's a feminist approach or a queer approach to translation. Really, is to have the humility to admit. I mean, it shouldn't need to be said, right? But to actually say, I don't understand this bit. My Arabic is good enough to be translating. I do speak Arabic, but hey, I'm stuck on this bit. I think is something so basic but so important that not everybody does, and actually that's a kind of a whole other conversation. But yeah,
or people do it without acknowledging it, which is the other thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I brought up the biography because this is also something that comes up where her work has been read very much biographically, when it talks about abuse, or when it talks about this kind of and you try to untangle this in the afterword, and you speak about, of course, the complexity of her work and the huge variety of characters and of settings that you find in the stories, and also you mentioned this, you use this phrase of her feminist literary activism, which I'm interested in. What do you mean by that?
Well, I guess I mean quite a lot of different things in different moments in a way. I certainly get the impression from people who knew her that she was that she had an organic, an innate feminism, instinctively, from a young age. But how I sort of see it coming across in her work is, I mean, and any of the pieces that, like the piece I just read, which are so confrontational about kind of gender depression and the patriarchy. I mean, they are in a very straightforward way, I guess. I would see them as feminist kind of literary activism. But I mean, one of the last pieces that I think she wrote, which is a non-fiction, one of the only kind of non-fiction pieces that is around online, and I actually found it really late on in the process of writing the afterword, which is kind of crazy, which is partly why it's only referenced in the notes. But it's an article where she's really raging about kind of bourgeois activist women, so-called activist women, coming into the hospital on International Women's Day.
On March 8th.
Yes, to make a little a little visit, and then that's it, and then they go off to a nice restaurant or whatever. And she is absolutely furious about this, and she's really speaking out about it, and about the politics of healthcare and so on. But very much from a feminist perspective, about kind of, you know, feeling betrayed, from an intersectional perspective, I guess, because she's feeling betrayed by these kind of elite women. And but yeah, I mean, how else do I see her as being a feminist activist within her work? I guess I see it as so woven into so much of how she uses language, and how she gets around and in and out of her characters. I mean, the thing about the biography, which is interesting to me, you're saying that, you know, she is received in a certain way in Morocco because of her story, but obviously she's not, you know, like, here we are promoting this book by this unknown, you know. I think I think I did an event about her a few years ago where I was like, the most important Moroccan, the most famous Moroccan feminist you've never heard of, or something, you know, because it's that, right? And so in a way, well, okay, we don't have that problem in the Anglophone sphere, that people are like, oh, that's that woman who did that thing. But the problem with that then is that it's super important how we present her, right? So it's super important that we don't get reductive.
Because there are already pre-established ways that Arab women writers get received
Aren't they just? Yeah. And also that writers from the global south get received. I mean, you know, something that I noticed is that in a couple of instances already, the book has been reviewed or commented on as being stories about poor working class Moroccans. And that's fascinating to me, because obviously I've read the text much more deeply than anyone else is going to probably read it, right? But very much, very obviously, not all the stories are set in a working class or poor milieu, right? And yet we're so ready for people from the global south to be poor that we say, oh yes, that's what the whole book is about, you know. So this kind of thing, it's very difficult. I mean, one of the roles of us, kind of, you know, people standing on the bridge, you know, trying to bring things across or whatever, is it's quite a heavy responsibility to not let it be a reductive portrait of the writer, because she's writing a lot about illness, and she's writing a lot about gender and patriarchy, but she's lots of other things too. So to get away from people being seen as monolithic feels like a big part of the responsibility of, I guess, people who are not Arab, who are trying to in some way present stuff, you know, to the rest of the world, if that's what we're doing.
Yeah, and one thing that strikes me in the book is yes, a lot of the characters and a lot of the situations are dark, right? These like, most of the characters are not happy, but there is a kind of very, very striking force of life. I mean, in the language, in the humor, in the kind of the combativeness of all of these people across the board. And that comes through usually in the use of spoken language, in the use of Darija. Sometimes there's all of this kind of bursts of life and rebellion that come through the text, that I feel are one of the most important features of it.
Yeah, and that's what's really sad. One of the many things that's so sad about her having died so crazily young and unnecessarily, you know, through not being able to access the right treatment. Because, you know, those last stories that she wrote, she seemed to have a new kind of confidence to explore linguistic hybridity, really. And where would she have taken that? You know, what would she be doing now?
I suggest we read a second.
Yeah, time is going super quickly.
Yeah, time is going fast. So this one, the English reading will be a little longer, and I will just read the beginning in Arabic for a taste, and then I'll let you read the rest. It's from a story, one of the later stories, called Briwat. And Briwat are these triangular fried samosa type things.
I'm so happy that you said samosa type, because my original...
Well, because I know that will be recognizable here, but
yeah, but I mean, that's been they're kind of like Moroccan samosas, and people are like, you can't say that.
It's okay. We don't have time to go into details. So Briwat. هو يقول إنني لا أحبها. ينفخ سيجارته كازا ويكمل: أنت فقط تعودت على وجودها. سألته: وما هو الحب إذن؟ أخذ يحرك يديه كثيرا في الفراغ ويغمض عينيه كأنه سيأتي بأسرار صنع الذرة. ثم أخذ يبحث في جيب جاكيتته عن سجائره، وأخيرا قال بفرنسيته الركيكة: Il n'y a pas une définition. قد يكون كلامه صحيحا، وأنني تعودت على مفتاحة، بالمناسبة هذا هو اسمها، ولأن اسمها فيه شيء من الحدة ويذكرني بالمفتاحة أي الإبرة، فجدتي كانت تسمي الإبرة مفتاحة، يذكرني الاسم كذلك بمفتاح علب السردين، لذلك كنت أناديها فاتحة. وكانت تغضب وتقول إن والدها عندما ولدت ذبح على اسمها فروجا بلديا ولا يحق لي أن أغيره. كنت أقول لها إنه اسم الدلع فقط، فتبتسم تظهر أسنانها غير المرتبة التي تحاول دون جدوى أن تخفيها بيدها. لكن فعلا قد أكون فقط تعودت على وجودها. تعودت أن ألتقيها كل يوم بعد خروجي من المدرسة، فأنا مدرس ابتدائي، أجدها بانتظاري. أول شيء أبحث عنه هو الكيس البلاستيكي الأسود. هل تحمله أم لا؟ الكيس البلاستيكي مهم، فأنا طوال 8 ساعات عمل أتخيله والوعاب يسيل وأصاب بالصدمة إذا لم تحمله. وقد أختصر لقائي بها من 2 إلى نصف ساعة متعللا بشيء ما، ويبدو أنها أصبحت تفهم الأمر، فلم تعد تأتي إلا والكيس البلاستيكي في يدها.
Briouat. He tells me that I don't love her. He takes a drag on his Kaza cigarette, then goes on, "You just got used to having her around, that's all." "So what is love then?" I ask him. He gesticulates at length, eyes closed, as if he's about to reveal the secrets of atom formation. Then he feels around in his jacket pocket for his cigarettes and finally proclaims, in his ropey French, "Il n'y a pas une définition." What he says might be true. Perhaps I just got used to Miftaha, which, by the way, is her name. There's something sharp about her name. It makes me think of a needle. Miftaha is what my grandmother used to call needles. Her name also reminds me of the miftah, the key on a tin of sardines, and that's why I used to call her Fatiha instead. She'd get angry about that and tell me that when she was born, her father slaughtered a fat, free-range rooster in her name, so I certainly didn't have any right to change it. I would tell her it was just an affectionate nickname. That would make her smile, showing those wonky teeth she was trying in vain to conceal with her hand. But maybe I really was just used to her being around. I got used to finding her there every day after I got out of school. I'm a primary school teacher. I'd find her waiting for me. The first thing I'd do was scan for the black plastic bag. Did she have it or not? The black plastic bag was important. I'd been imagining it throughout my 8-hour workday, my mouth watering, so I'd get a shock if she didn't bring it. Such a shock that I might cut our time together down from 2 hours to 30 minutes on some pretext or other. And it seems she worked out what was going on, because eventually she stopped ever turning up without a plastic bag of chicken or lamb or prawn briouat in her hand. My favourite briouat are the prawn ones and the chicken ones. She lies, says she makes the briouat at home, especially for me. I know she buys them from Ommi Mina, who sells them from a palm frond basket she sets up near the Armel shoe shop in Ma'arif. Her voice sounds like a chicken squawking when she calls out, "Briwet, briwet." One day I saw cockroaches going in and out of her palm frond basket, so I swore I would never eat briwet again. But when I saw Fatiha, or in fact when I saw the black plastic bag, I tried to put that oath right out of my mind, telling myself that cockroaches actually aren't such bad bugs. I'd once seen some Americans on TV eating a tray of roasted cockroaches with gusto. The sight of them made me switch off the set, saying to myself that even in times of total drought, famine, and buhyuf, our fathers didn't stoop to eating cockroaches. Our forefathers didn't stoop to eating cockroaches. In the end, I came to the conclusion that the roaches in America must be a special kind and would definitely be high in vitamins. I have, in fact, been used to her being around ever since childhood. We lived in the same carrián, and at nap time, when we sensed that her father wanted to sleep, us kids would get together in front of his shack and shout, "Ew, gross! What's Larbi doing to that cat?" Because it was well known that Larbi, Mustapha's father, had sex with cats. Cats mated and multiplied like crazy in our alley and never left Hellhawker's shack. We used to call Larbi Hellhawker because he sold moonshine on the sly. Some of the older Slakit boys from the area took it even further and staged a grotesque wedding party. They got hold of a cat and tied it onto a white izar sheet with some drops of blood and some sugar coelibs on it. They put the whole lot onto a cart pulled by a scrawny, mangy horse, and the women of the carrián followed along behind, ululating and shaking their bony butts. The crowd stopped in front of Hawker's shack door, dancing and throwing coins onto the blood-stained cloth. Hawker came out to see what was going on, and one of them shouted, "Congratulations, Hawker! Wishing you bliss and babies!" Hawker calmly leaned over the coins on the blood-spattered cloth. He picked them up and went back into his shack, to the amazement of everyone present. During all of this, Mustapha was looking over at us, apoplectic, and gesturing to me that she was going to slit my throat and hang me out to dry on the roof. So I put my middle finger up in her face and spat at her. Mustapha, or Ftiha, wasn't beautiful. Her teeth were crooked, and she had a bushy moustache, which was why we used to sometimes call her Abdul Qadir, making her so angry she'd throw stones at us. But once we were grown up and I had discovered, I don't know how or when, that I was in love with her, I told her, when we were in Park Murdoch while I was eating chicken briwet, that her moustache didn't bother me, but that in fact downy women were hot. She didn't know what being hot meant, but she seemed happy with that, and from then on, she took very good care of her moustache indeed.
So that's not the end of the story, but
but it is pretty much my favourite line in the book. She took very good care of her moustache.
It is a great line. She didn't know what being hot meant, but she seemed happy with that. And from then on, she took very good care of her moustache indeed. It's so unexpected where that went and how you go from waiting outside of the primary school with a black plastic bag full of Moroccan samosas
Yeah, and I mean, like, I don't know, it's funny reading that kind of complicated wedding scene, and it's funny listening to a reading, people would have been like, what, you know, and there's quite a lot of that section is an example of, you know, very dense with cultural references and actually
and suddenly reality becoming grotesque in this way, right? For half a page.
Yeah, and that's just like, oh yeah, because so that's something we used to get up to when we were kids. But anyway, now we eat briwet together every day in the park, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, read on to find out, did they get together properly in the end or not?
Yeah, and this thing that you said about the kind of flashback and then back to reality is something that I feel in these later stories becomes more and more prevalent. I mean, I think I mentioned in an email that I was thinking of it and I didn't explain. I was thinking of it in terms of parallel montage and like a cinematographic kind of parallel editing system, because it's very visual.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about it in particular about a story we have not read and we will not read, called Head Lice, where we have all of these it's quite short, but all of these situations kind of alternate. So we have the narrator as a child with her mother, kind of looking for lice in her hair and telling her the story of Haina to kind of keep her with her. So there's the story of the childhood story of looking for lice, plus the story that's being told during that story. And then in parallel, there's the narrator as an adult with the other women, the yellowish woman, the flabby woman, etc. And then in parallel, again, there's a narrator with her lover, online and offline. So all of these stories we kind of keep going in and out of them, and they're all related just by a little motif. The motif of the hair, the motif of holding on and leaving, the motif of the lice, and it's very. I mean, you could imagine it easily in a film, but she does it with this incredible prowess in just 3 or 4 pages.
Yeah, and that's one of her last stories that she wrote, and so I think that is the real tragedy, because where would she have gone with that? And she, those techniques. I guess we should turn to the questions, right?
We have a few questions, and I'll read the first one that I have here from Greg Cantor. Alice, were there any memorable stories or passages that went especially well for you, where you felt that your translation and understanding were particularly in sync with Malika's thoughts, meaning, and voice?
Ah, wow, I don't know. You're asking me to make a big claim. Yeah, Greg. I mean, there's definitely little moments where something clicks and you think, yeah, that really sounds like how I hear it in the original. Sometimes with a little spoken, I mean, we could do a whole other hour conversation about slang and rendering of slang, and that's something that I've always been really interested in my work, and the sort of in short, I mean, the impossibility of finding a sort of generic slang. There's no such thing, right? But as translators, you are kind of trying to do that, because you don't want to transport it and transplant it, and you don't want to make it sound specifically like this person comes from Liverpool or New Orleans or Hackney or whatever, or Brooklyn. So you're trying to get something that sounds like how people talk, but not too much like how one person talks, and that is a contradiction really in terms. But nevertheless, I think there are some moments when you think, yeah, this is how it should sound. But I don't think I'm going to start quoting.
Speaking of the slang, there's one that made me laugh earlier. There's in the story called Just Different, the one that has the transgender or transvestite sex worker who says at some point that they started getting harassed by these people with beards, which are supposed to be the religious people. And in Arabic it says which is the beard and disrespect. So beard, which is supposed to be a sign of some kind of social status and respect, and disrespect, and he translated it as beardo weirdo, which I think is great.
Yeah, well, one of the early drafts of that, I think, was we'd have to check back, and that maybe Lauren might remember, but I think it was something like hairy cunt face. We were like, yeah, what's the register? Because like the sort of the lack of respect, how do you bring that across? I mean, when there are concepts, aren't there, that are quite hard to map linguistically,
sure. Because they're not just words, they're charged with lived situations that are very situated.
Yeah, and absolutely. And so sometimes, on the wrong day or without a coffee, you can think, well, this whole thing's impossible. Like, why would you try? Right. And there is, I think, also it's a compromise, isn't it? You have to keep in mind that the people reading the English are not going to be able to read the Arabic. So it comes back to the campfire thing. You weren't there. You should have been there. It was amazing that night, but I'll try and tell you what it was like. That's what we're doing, really, isn't it?
And also translation is not always or cannot be a kind of one-on-one, word for word. I mean, you lose here, you gain here. It's not like
Yeah.
you're not translating this bit and this bit and this bit. You're translating a story, and so the registers, you have to work them over a certain number of pages.
Yeah, and that's something definitely that, I mean, I'm not like big on translation theory, but the thing about compensation where you think, well, that bit didn't quite, that bit didn't come across quite crude enough, or that bit didn't come across maybe quite religious enough, and so you do it in another moment a little bit, and so that you step back, and the kind of sum of it, the end balance is there, That's a comfort, I think, to the perfectionist translator.
Marwa Belghazi says, "Hi Alice. I'm
Hey,
curious about how you decided which words to keep in Darija, Arabic,
yeah,
and which to translate to English. For example, Karian in the Briwat story."
yeah, good question. Well, usually, I mean, basically, and I've actually got a glossary in the book as well, which helps one to be able to do that. Um, in, I guess, probably all cases, well, so either it would be something that I think would be a known term, which I don't think actually crops up in this book, but if there was, I don't know, if there was falafel or something, these days you don't have to say, a deep fried chickpea ball. You can just say falafel. So that kind of thing. But in this instance, no, it was usually things that I felt were too specific to really render elegantly. There's a few things that I've done a kind of stealth, what we call a stealth gloss, where you kind of stealthily sneak in and explain it, making it seem like it's within the. I mean, actually, that phrase when I read out about the wedding party and I said, some of the boys staged a grotesque wedding party. That isn't in the original. It's because all of those references were so obviously wedding references, but I wasn't sure, and with Lauren as well, we weren't sure that that was really going to come across. And so rather than saying, um, what everything is, I mean, there is a bit of stealth glossing going on there as well. So the sugar, I think I say sugar coelibs, right? I could have just said coelib, but you still don't know from sugar coelib what that is, and you probably know Marwa, and but you can know as well from reading the glossary that it's a kind of phallic sugar object that's used for a sort of ritual in some traditional weddings where the bride jumps over, and that was too much to get in, and I didn't want to. And also, I like the sound of some words being in there. With Karian, for example, I think that pretty much all the words around. So a Karian is a kind of unregulated informal housing settlement that's grown up within a city, and all the words for that in English are problematic, politically problematic. I didn't want to get into saying, and they're not precise. I didn't want to get into calling it a slum or or shanty town or favela, or and actually Carian, the etymology of Carian is really specific to Casablanca, because it comes from the French is it carrière, the quarry?
Carrière, quarries, carrière.
Yeah, and it's, but that's where the first settlements of that kind grew up in Casablanca. So I feel like it's a word that's rooted there, and I felt that the stories hold their own in showing you what the Carian is to some extent. So that's some of the reasoning.
Yeah, and in any way, in some way, Malika herself shows the way. I mean, the title story of her book, when it was published in Arabic, is 36 in Arabic, but which is really a French word transliterated into Arabic, and it means 36. And it also corresponds to a very specific health reference in Morocco that wouldn't be understood anywhere else. And it's also, so it's the title of the book is in Arabic, but not in Arabic. And also probably because there was this sense that perhaps the book would be read by non-Moroccans. There are some footnotes in the Arabic book that explain some of the colloquial Moroccan expressions, which was really interesting for me to see.
And that's really cute because she did that. She did that herself. The publishers and editors didn't do that. That was her thinking this is going to be read outside the country, which it hardly was actually, I think, at the time. But perhaps it will be more now. It is back in print in Arabic now, and yeah. But she had the. I mean, she even had an asterisk to explain actually what 36 was about the wing of the hospital,
Yes.
So she wasn't taking for granted that people would get everything. And then later, in her later work, where she started to put in much more Darija, and I know, there's some of the correspondence between her and her good friend Aida Nasrallah, in which she kind of says she's excited and kind of nervous about, will people understand it? Because Aida is Palestinian and she's talking about Egyptian friends, and she's excited kind of that people would have to try and engage with Darija, which I think is also a kind of activist thing, right? Because rather than just saying, oh no, let's not even ask anybody to, oh God, Darija's so hard, let's not ask anybody to engage with it.
And something that is and has been very present for Moroccan writers, because our spoken language, our version of Arabic is the least understood around the Arab world generally. So my daughter always asks me, so you understand what this Lebanese person is saying and what this Egyptian person is saying and what this Iraqi person is saying, but they don't understand you. What is that? and so what happens with that is that then Moroccans tend to just not use Darija very much, or to censor it, or to explain it and all of that. And so there is something at stake in affirming the use of it, and different writers do it differently, obviously, in the text.
Yeah. And I don't know, it would you tell me, but it seems to me that she was a bit ahead of her time in trying to push for that, with the last few things that she did, push for it a bit more. Because I mean, some of the contemporary work that's being done,
including French.
Yeah,
she would use the French, because she's transcribing those MSN messenger conversations where some of the
computer
software's language that comes from the computer
Yeah.
language comes out in French, and she uses it in French also.
Yeah, and that would have probably seemed more futuristic, more contemporary then. That kind of age is quick. Like now we're used to kind of software language or whatever, but so and so's got come online and little notifications being in French, and that was quite a hard to know what to. I mean, like now with the character kind of being pretentious, and actually the French is slightly misspelt, right? That as part of his pretend, she's mercilessly I wanted to leave that in kind of for that reason, but it didn't seem to really work to try and leave in the computer language in French, in the translation. But yeah, I mean, some of the contemporary, Skef Kerf and people like that are doing kind of long form journalism publishing in Darija, I can imagine that she would have been into that, and she would have been involved.
For sure. I don't know how we're doing on time. I think we're supposed to end soon, but Pierce, maybe will tell us in the chat. But we do have another question that I will read here.
Pierce, are you going to pull the plug?
No, let's do the last question. I'm hoping you can answer it quickly, though, Alice.
Great. So Beardo Weirdo, that's amazing, Alice. This is from Tenzin Diki. Any other little cases or instances like that? Would love to hear more about that, or something that people want to know what you're proud of out of it. So why don't you just tell us something that you're super proud of working out, or more cases of stealth gloss, your choice.
Oh, Tenzin, so sweet of you, darling, my dear friend. Well, I don't know. Yeah, on the spot, am I going to say what my most, other instances of stealth gloss? Well, actually, no, something yeah, we can't get into the full detail of, but we were talking about before. So there's this amazing, in Housefly, which is one of the stories towards the end of the book, one of the last things that she wrote, which is the one that we were talking about already, about the woman who's chatting online, and she's having this kind of, initially she's having a really not unexciting engagement with this guy who doesn't, chat with this guy who doesn't really get her, and she's putting in all these references, and he's being kind of boring. And there's this bit where she says to him, she types to him, some lines of Darija that I was just like, what is going on here, man? And actually, I hope Noordin won't mind me saying that when I initially asked him, he was like, I don't get a lot of this either. Like, this is obscure, stuff. And he went off and researched it and came back with this kind of amazing breakdown of okay, so I've worked out that this is an old word for partridge, and this is a reference to this, and blah, blah, blah. And so then I had this kind of, Tenzin is a translator too, and anyone who is a translator listening, you get this situation where you're like, oh my God, okay, so I've got to make this thing rhyme, and it's got to somehow cling. And I love doing that, actually. I love those challenges of making rhymes. And so I guess that's something that I'm pretty proud of. Yeah, and there were several different versions, but it came out. It's a little ditty that the vendors of this hard, like this rock candy thing that they used to sell outside amusement parks to children. They sing it to sell it, and it came out in English as candies, eats and sees, squawking, squeaking kiddies, full sworn guarantees, blessed by was and Sufis, candies, eats and sees. So it doesn't really make kind of a lot of sense, you know, but I feel that that is pretty closely illustrating of that dense little old lyric, with the sounds that the kids make and the Sufi blessings, and yeah, so that's something that I'm pleased with. I mean, I'm quite pleased with the book in general. When it first was in hardcover, you know, between covers, I kind of was like, oh, I can't really bear to look at it. But now I'm starting to be like, yeah, it's pretty cool.
Thank you both. This has been wonderful. This has been an utter treat. Lots of love in the chat. Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you everyone for being here.
I love what you said, that there were footnotes in the original, and so she thought that this was going to be widely read, and I'm very glad that it now will be in your utterly brilliant translation, Alice. And thank you, Omar, for joining us, for celebrating. Thank you everyone for coming. The book is beautiful. It's out now from Feminist Press. We have it on our shelves online. Thank you everyone.
And I should just say as well that there is also a UK edition under a different name from Saki called Something Strange Like Hunger, but it's the same book, and so people who are over here, if they want, can get this. They can also get the American edition.
Suddenly there's two new Malika Moustadraf books around.
Yeah, I know. And there's an audiobook. There's an audiobook which is narrated by some really great actors, some really great Arab American actors who do an incredible job. So,
oh, that's lovely. Okay, very cool. Thank you everyone. You have many different opportunities in which to get the book. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks so much. Lots of love, everyone. Bye.